Part 1. The Dust and the Desperate. The sun hung merciless over Cedar Ridge, a town that seemed to shrink beneath its glare like a wounded animal seeking shade. Dust devils danced down the main street, stirring up the fine grit that settled on everything. The weathered storefronts, the hitching posts, the few souls brave enough to venture out in the heat of midday. Most folks stayed indoors during these hours, tending to their own business and keeping their eyes fixed on their own troubles. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed before they reached the town limits, and where everyone knew everyone else's affairs whether they wanted to or not. The kind of place where a woman traveling alone would draw stares, and a woman in religious garb would draw twice as many. Sister Margaret walked down that dusty street with steps that spoke of miles already traveled and miles yet to go. Her simple brown habit, once neat and pressed, now bore the evidence of hard roads, dust ground into the fabric, a small tear near the hem, creases that spoke of nights spent sleeping under stars instead of beneath convent walls. She couldn't have been more than 22. But her face carried the weight of someone who had seen more of the world's harsh edges than most twice her age. Her eyes, a clear gray like storm clouds gathering, swept the street with the cautious assessment of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. She moved with purpose toward the public well that stood in the small square at the town's heart, her hands steady despite the obvious exhaustion that lined her shoulders. The well was a simple thing, wooden posts supporting a roof to keep the worst of the sun off, a rope and bucket hanging from a crossbeam. Margaret approached it like a pilgrim reaching a shrine, her steps quickening despite herself at the promise of cool water. She had been walking since dawn, and the canteen at her side had run dry hours ago. She was reaching for the rope when a voice stopped her cold. "Hold on there, sister." The man who stepped from the shade of the mercantile wore a deputy's badge and carried himself with the particular swagger of someone unused to being questioned. Deputy Thomas Kinley was his name, though most folks just called him Deputy Tom. He had the soft look of a man who spent more time in the saloon than in the saddle, and his pale eyes held the mean glint of someone who enjoyed having even a small measure of power over others. "Public wells for residents," he said, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt. "Strangers need to ask permission first." Margaret's hand stilled on the rope. She turned to face him, her expression calm despite the wariness that flickered in her eyes. "I beg your pardon, sir. I wasn't aware of any such requirement. Might I ask permission, then?" Deputy Tom circled her slowly, taking in every detail of her appearance with an obvious relish that made her skin crawl. "Well now, that depends. What's a nun doing wandering around out here without a proper escort? Don't seem right, if you ask me, don't seem proper." "I'm traveling to rejoin my order," Margaret said quietly. Her voice carried the kind of dignity that couldn't be stripped away by dust or exhaustion or small-minded cruelty. "My business is my own, as I'm sure yours is yours." "Oh, but see, that's where you're wrong, sister." Tom stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "My business is keeping this town safe from undesirable elements. And a woman with no home, no husband, no proper place, well, that's what I'd call undesirable." Margaret said nothing. She had learned long ago that some men fed on reaction, grew bolder when they sensed fear or anger. Instead, she simply stood her ground, her hands folded in front of her, waiting. "Tell you what," Tom continued, enjoying himself now. "You move along to the next town, and we'll forget this whole conversation ever happened. Cedar Ridge don't need the kind of trouble that follows. Lost souls." It was then that Margaret became aware of another presence. Someone had emerged from the blacksmith shop across the street and stood watching the exchange with the stillness of a man accustomed to observing before acting. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent his days under the open sky. His clothes were simple but well cared for. Canvas pants, a cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves, boots that had seen honest work. A cowboy by the look of him, though something in his bearing suggested he was more than just another drifter. Daniel Cross had been shoeing a horse when he first noticed the woman in brown walking down the street. There was something about the way she moved, determined despite her obvious exhaustion, proud despite her circumstances. That had caught his attention. He'd seen plenty of desperate people pass through Cedar Ridge, but this one was different. This one carried herself like someone who hadn't given up. Not yet. Now, watching Deputy Tom circle her like a buzzard, Daniel felt a familiar anger stir in his chest. Tom Kinley was a bully and a coward, the kind of man who used his badge to settle personal scores and line his own pockets. Daniel had seen him run honest folks out of town for no better reason than that he could, and it left a sour taste that no amount of whiskey could wash away. Margaret lifted her chin slightly, meeting Tom's gaze without flinching. "I appreciate your concern, Deputy, but I'll be moving on when I'm ready, and not before." Tom's face darkened. "Now see here, sister, is there a problem here, Tom?" Daniel's voice carried across the square, calm but with an edge that made the deputy turn sharply. Daniel approached with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own skin, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready for whatever might come. "No problem, Cross," Tom said, though his tone had shifted, become less certain. "Just explaining the local customs to our visitor." Daniel's gaze flicked to Margaret, taking in the dust on her habit, the exhaustion she tried to hide, the way she held herself ready for whatever came next. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw something there that made his chest tighten. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of wary hope, like someone who had been disappointed too many times to expect rescue but couldn't quite stop hoping for it. "Seems to me the custom around here is to offer water to travelers," Daniel said mildly, "especially on a day like this." Tom's hand drifted toward his gun, a gesture meant to intimidate. "Like I said, Cross, this don't concern you." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But I'd hate for word to get around that Cedar Ridge turned away a woman of God. Might not sit well with the church-going folks." It was a neat trap, and Tom knew it. For all his bluster, he couldn't afford to alienate the religious community, not when his position depended on staying in the good graces of the town's more respectable citizens. His face went through several interesting shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. "Fine," he spat, "but you're responsible for her. Cross, any trouble she causes, it's on your head." With that, he stalked away, leaving Margaret and Daniel standing alone by the well. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and careful assessments. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Thank you," she said simply. Daniel nodded toward the well. "Water's yours if you want it." She drew up the bucket with hands that shook only slightly, drank deeply, then filled her canteen with the methodical movements of someone who had learned not to waste anything. When she was finished, she turned to face him again. "I'm Sister Margaret," she said. "Daniel Cross." He touched the brim of his hat. "You heading somewhere in particular, sister?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Daniel could see her weighing options, making calculations behind those storm-gray eyes. When she finally spoke, her words came out steady and clear, like someone stating a simple fact rather than making a desperate proposal. "Mr. Cross," she said, If marrying you could save my convent and give a group of orphaned children a home, would you consider it? Daniel went very still. He had expected many things from this conversation, but not this. Not a marriage proposal delivered with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. He studied her face, looking for signs of jest or madness, but found only a terrible practical honesty. "That's quite a question, sister," he said finally. "It's quite a situation," she replied. Behind them, the town continued its lazy afternoon routine, oblivious to the moment that hung between them like a held breath. Daniel found himself thinking of his empty house, his solitary meals, the long evenings with only the sound of wind for company. Then he looked at this woman, this stranger who had just offered to bind her life to his for the sake of children he'd never met, and felt something shift inside his chest. "Why don't you come out to my place?" he said at last. "Get some food in you, some rest. We can talk about situations. Once you've had a chance to catch your breath." Margaret studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. "I'd be grateful for that kindness, Mr. Cross." As they walked toward the livery stable where Daniel kept his horse, neither of them noticed Deputy Tom watching from the shadows of the saloon. His face twisted with a rage that promised this was far from over. Part 2. The Unexpected Proposal. The road to Daniel's ranch stretched 3 miles beyond the last weathered building of Cedar Ridge, winding through scrub brush and scattered cottonwoods that offered precious little shade. Margaret rode behind him on his bay gelding, her hands resting lightly on his waist, a necessity that seemed to embarrass them both, though neither spoke of it. The horse's steady gait and the warm afternoon sun worked their own kind of magic, and Margaret found herself fighting the urge to simply close her eyes and let exhaustion claim her. Daniel kept his silence during the ride, but she could feel the questions radiating from him like heat from a stone. Her proposal had been bold, perhaps foolish, but desperation had a way of stripping away the luxury of conventional courtship. She had learned in the past months that survival sometimes required choices that would have seemed unthinkable in her former life. When they finally crested a low hill, the Cross Ranch spread before them like something from a different world. The house was modest but well-maintained, built of solid timber with a wide front porch that suggested a man who appreciated the simple pleasure of sitting and watching the world go by. A barn stood nearby, flanked by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of steady work and careful planning. The land itself rolled away in gentle swells, golden grass dancing in the afternoon breeze. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly, and meant it. Daniel helped her down from the horse, his hands careful and brief at her waist. "It's home," he said simply. Inside, the house held the particular quietness of a place where one person lived alone. The main room was clean but sparse, a few chairs arranged around a stone fireplace, a table that had seen better days, shelves lined with books whose spines were cracked from reading. Everything was practical, functional, touched by neither luxury nor neglect. "There's a room upstairs," Daniel said, not quite meeting her eyes. "It's small, but it's got a good window and clean bedding. You can rest there while I see about some supper." Margaret followed him up a narrow staircase to a room tucked under the eaves. It was indeed small, but it held everything she could have hoped for. A simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the endless sweep of grassland. After weeks of sleeping in haymows and abandoned line shacks, it seemed like a palace. "Thank you," she said. "I'll try not to impose on your hospitality for long." Daniel paused in the doorway. "Sister." "Margaret, that proposal of yours, were you serious about it?" She turned to face him fully, her hands clasped in front of her. I don't have the luxury of jest, Mr. Cross. Everything I said was true. Tell me about this convent of yours. Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the rolling prairie. St. Catherine sits about 40 miles north of here, near the territorial border. I run a small school for orphaned children, 12 little ones, ages 5 to 14. When Sister Adelaide passed last winter, I was left alone to care for them. That's a heavy burden for someone so young. Age doesn't matter much when children need feeding. She spoke without self-pity, as if stating a simple fact. The territorial government has been pressuring us to close. They say a single woman can't properly run such an establishment. They want to transfer the children to the state facility in Denver. Daniel had heard stories about the state facility, overcrowded, understaffed, the kind of place where children learn to survive rather than to hope. And marriage would change their minds? A married woman with a proper husband would be seen as respectable, capable. Margaret turned from the window to meet his gaze. I won't lie to you. Mr. Cross, I'm asking you to marry a stranger to save a group of children you've never met. It's not a proposal any reasonable man would accept. What would you expect from such a marriage? The question hung between them like smoke. Margaret had clearly thought about this, had prepared herself for the practical realities of what she was suggesting. A legal document, she said quietly. Nothing more. I would keep house, help with the ranch work, and care for the children when we could bring them here. You would have a wife in name, and I would have the legal standing to keep St. Catherine's open. We would be partners, in business, if not in heart. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, studying her with those quiet brown eyes. You've given this considerable thought. I've had considerable time to think. The territorial inspector is coming again in 6 weeks. If I don't have a husband by then, they'll close us down and scatter the children to whatever homes they can find. Her voice remained steady, but Daniel caught the slight tremor in her hands. Some of those children have been with me since they were babies. They're all the family I have left in this world. What happened to your real family? Margaret was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Fever took them when I was 16. Mother, father, my 2 little brothers. I joined the convent because I had nowhere else to go. Sister Adelaide became like a mother to me, and the children became like siblings. I know it's not the traditional path, but it's the life I chose. And now you're willing to choose a different life to protect them. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Daniel nodded slowly, then straightened from the doorway. Rest now. We can talk more over supper. Alone in the small room, Margaret sank onto the bed and allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. She had spoken boldly, but the truth was she had no idea what kind of man Daniel Cross really was. He seemed decent enough, but she had learned that appearances could deceive. Still, desperation had left her with few choices, and something in his steady manner gave her hope that he might be the answer to her prayers. Downstairs, Daniel stood in his kitchen, staring at the simple ingredients that would become their evening meal: bacon, beans, cornbread, the staples of a bachelor's existence. Nothing fancy enough for a woman who had just proposed to reshape both their lives. He found himself thinking about the loneliness that had settled over his days like dust. 3 years since he'd lost his intended bride to cholera. 3 years of eating solitary meals and talking to his horses for company. He'd convinced himself he preferred the quiet, but Margaret's presence had already changed something in the atmosphere of his home. There was something about her that called to him, not just her beauty, though she was lovely beneath the exhaustion and worry. It was her courage that drew him, the way she'd stood up to Deputy Tom, the way she'd looked him straight in the eye and made her impossible proposal. It was the careful way she'd spoken of the children, as if they were precious beyond measure. As he worked over the stove, Daniel allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to share his home with someone again, to have purpose beyond the daily routine of cattle and crops, to be part of something larger than his own solitary existence. By the time Margaret came downstairs, drawn by the smell of cooking food, he had made his decision. They ate in companionable silence as the sun set beyond the kitchen window, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Finally, as Margaret helped clear the dishes, Daniel spoke. "I've been thinking about your proposal." Margaret's hands stilled on the plates. "And?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that those children are lucky to have someone willing to fight so hard for them." "That's not an answer." Daniel turned to face her fully. "Yes, it is. Yes, Sister Margaret, I'll marry you." The plate in Margaret's hands trembled slightly before she set it carefully on the counter. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, though whether from relief or something else, Daniel couldn't tell. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll ride to town tomorrow and speak to the preacher. If we're going to do this, we might as well do it proper." Margaret nodded, then looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes. "Why? Why would you agree to such a thing?" Daniel considered the question, thought about the loneliness that had become his constant companion, thought about the way she'd spoken of her children with such fierce protectiveness. "Maybe," he said finally, "because I think we both deserve a chance at something better than what we've got. Maybe because those kids deserve someone willing to stand up for them. Or maybe because I'm tired of eating supper alone." That night, as Margaret lay in the narrow bed under the eaves, she listened to the sound of Daniel moving quietly through the house below. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, but for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, vast and full of possibility. Part 3. The Ranch and the Quiet Understanding. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning in the small white chapel that served Cedar Ridge's faithful. Reverend Samuel Hayes, a kindly man with silver hair and gentle eyes, performed the ceremony with the dignity it deserved, asking no uncomfortable questions about the hasty arrangements or the unusual circumstances that had brought the couple together. Margaret wore her cleanest brown dress, not her habit, for she had quietly set aside her religious garments the night before, folding them with the same care one might show a treasured but outgrown childhood toy. Daniel had offered to buy her a proper wedding dress, but she had declined with a shake of her head and a soft-spoken, "This will do just fine." The only witnesses were the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Patience Hayes, and old Henry Morrison, who swept the church floors and had happened to be there when they arrived. Neither Daniel nor Margaret had family to invite, and friends seemed like a luxury neither could afford in their current circumstances. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Margaret's cheek with the gentle propriety of a man who understood the delicate nature of their arrangement. She accepted the gesture with quiet grace, her hands steady as she signed the marriage certificate that would serve as her shield against those who would scatter her children to the winds. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their first journey together. Margaret, now Mrs. Cross, she reminded herself with a strange flutter in her chest, sat behind Daniel on his horse. But the silence between them held a different quality now. It was the silence of two people who had crossed a bridge together and were still learning what lay on the other side. Over the following days, they developed the careful rhythms of polite strangers sharing a home. Margaret took over the kitchen and the household tasks with an efficiency that spoke of years managing the convent's domestic needs. She rose before dawn to start the coffee and have breakfast ready when Daniel came in from the morning chores. She mended his shirts with neat, precise stitches and kept the house clean without making it feel less like his own space. Daniel, for his part, treated her with the same courteous respect he might show a cherished guest. He made sure she had everything she needed for her work. Brought her small gifts from his trips to town, a packet of flower seeds, a book he thought she might enjoy, a bolt of blue cloth that matched her eyes. He never presumed upon the intimacy their legal status might have granted him. Never entered her room without invitation. Never made her feel like anything other than a valued partner in their unusual enterprise. Their meals together were quiet affairs, punctuated by small talk about the weather, the cattle, the state of the vegetable garden Margaret had planted behind the house. Neither of them mentioned the convent or the children waiting there, though Margaret's eyes would sometimes drift toward the northern horizon with a longing that made Daniel's chest tighten. It was during their second week of marriage that Daniel first suggested she might like to learn to ride properly. They were sitting on the front porch in the evening, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, when he noticed her gaze following the path that led away from the ranch. "Might be useful for you to have your own horse," he said carefully, "in case you need to go places when I'm not around." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "I've never ridden alone. The convent didn't exactly encourage such independence." "Lot of things the convent didn't encourage, I'd imagine," Daniel said mildly. "Doesn't mean they weren't worth learning." The next morning found them in the corral behind the barn, where Daniel had saddled a gentle mare named Buttercup, a golden palomino with kind eyes and the patience of a saint. Margaret approached the horse with the same cautious dignity she brought to everything else, her movements careful but unafraid. "She's beautiful," Margaret murmured, running her hand along the mare's neck. "She's yours if you want her," Daniel said. "Been needing someone to appreciate her properly." The riding lessons became a daily ritual. Daniel was a patient teacher, explaining the basics of horsemanship with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He showed her how to mount and dismount, how to hold the reins, how to use her voice and posture to communicate with the horse. Margaret proved to be a quick learner, though her first attempts were marked by a stiffness that spoke of years spent moving through life with careful, measured steps. It was only gradually that she began to relax into the rhythm of the horse's gait, to trust in the connection between rider and mount. The breakthrough came during their fifth lesson, when Buttercup shied at a rabbit that darted across their path. Margaret had been trotting in a wide circle around the corral when the mare suddenly stepped sideways, and for a moment it looked as if she might tumble to the ground. Instead, she found her balance and guided the horse back into line with an instinctive grace that surprised them both. "Well done," Daniel called from where he leaned against the fence, and Margaret looked up to find him smiling. The first real, unguarded smile she'd seen from him since their wedding day. Something loosened in her chest at that smile, some knot of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Without thinking, she touched her heels to Buttercup's sides and urged the mare into a canter, her brown skirts flying and her hair coming loose from its careful pins. For a few precious moments, she was simply a woman on a horse, racing the wind with laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her chest. When she finally pulled Buttercup to a stop near the fence where Daniel waited, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "That was," she began, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. Freedom, Daniel finished quietly, and she nodded as if he'd spoken her thoughts aloud. It was after that breakthrough that the real conversations began, not the careful small talk of polite strangers, but the gradual sharing of stories, memories, dreams that had been carefully tucked away. Margaret told him about the children at St. Catherine's, little Sarah who was afraid of storms, 10-year-old James who could calculate sums in his head faster than most adults, baby Emma who had been left on the convent steps with nothing but a note pinned to her blanket. Daniel shared his own stories, about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the woman he'd been meant to marry before cholera took her, about the loneliness that had driven him west in search of something he couldn't name. They were careful conversations, each of them testing the waters of trust. But they were real in a way their earlier exchanges had not been. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear, Margaret asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Do you ever regret it? This arrangement of ours?" Daniel considered the question, rolling it around in his mind like a stone in his palm. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that the world is the kind of place where a good woman like you has to marry a stranger to protect children who need care." "But regret the marriage itself?" He shook his head. "No. Margaret, I don't regret it." She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to think I knew what my life would look like. Prayer and service and the quiet satisfaction of doing God's work. I never imagined this." "Is it so terrible?" Margaret turned to look at him, her gray eyes soft in the lamplight. "No," she said simply. "It's not terrible at all." As the weeks passed, they fell into an easier rhythm. Margaret took over more of the ranch's business correspondence, her neat handwriting and careful way with words proving invaluable when dealing with cattle buyers and supply merchants. Daniel taught her to shoot, despite her initial protests that violence went against her nature. "The world's not always a gentle place," he said, checking the sights on the rifle he'd selected for her, lighter than his own, better suited to her smaller frame. "Sometimes protecting what you love means being willing to fight for it." Margaret proved to be a natural marksman, her steady hands and careful attention to detail serving her well. The first time she hit the center of the target Daniel had set up behind the barn, she stared at the hole in the tin can for a long moment before setting the rifle aside with shaking hands. "I never thought I'd be the sort of person who could do such a thing," she murmured. "You're not doing it to hurt anyone," Daniel reminded her gently. "You're learning to protect yourself. There's a difference." It was during their 6th week of marriage that the first real test of their partnership arrived. Margaret was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Daniel was in the north pasture, checking on a cow that had been having trouble calving, and wouldn't be back until evening. She recognized Deputy Tom Kinley immediately, though he wasn't alone this time. 2 other men rode with him, strangers with hard faces and the kind of casual cruelty that made Margaret's skin crawl. They reined up in front of the house with a show of dust and bluster clearly meant to intimidate. "Well, well," Tom called out, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "If it isn't the bride herself, where's that husband of yours, Mrs. Cross?" Margaret stood perfectly still, her hands resting calmly at her sides despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. "He'll be back directly," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Is there something I can help you with, Deputy?" Tom's smile was unpleasant. "Oh, I think there might be. You see, I've been doing some checking on your little convent up north. Seems there's some question about whether your marriage is quite as legitimate as you'd like folks to believe. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Tom stepped closer, his companions flanking him like wolves. See, word is you're still wearing nun's vows under that pretty dress. Makes a man wonder if you can really be a proper wife to anyone. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, but she kept her chin raised. My vows are my own business, as is my marriage. Not when it affects the welfare of those children, Tom said, his voice taking on a mock-serious tone. Territorial law is pretty clear about fraud, Mrs. Cross. Pretty harsh penalties for folks who try to deceive the authorities. It was then that Margaret heard the sound that would haunt Tom Kinley's dreams for weeks to come, the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked. She turned to see Daniel emerging from the barn, his weapon held with the easy competence of a man who knew how to use it. "Afternoon, Tom," Daniel said conversationally. "Didn't expect to see you so far from town." The deputy's face went through several interesting colors before settling on an unhealthy purple. "Cross, we were just having a friendly conversation with your wife." "Looked more like harassment from where I'm standing," Daniel replied, moving to place himself between Margaret and the three men. "Might be best if you moved along now." Tom's hand drifted toward his gun, but stopped when he saw the look in Daniel's eyes. Whatever he saw there made him think better of escalating the situation. "This isn't over," he said, mounting his horse with less swagger than he'd shown when dismounting. "I'll be watching you both real close." As the three men rode away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. Daniel was beside her in an instant, his strong hands steadying her. "You did good," he said quietly. "Stood your ground like a true rancher's wife." Margaret looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. "Daniel," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the gratitude and something deeper that swelled in her chest. "I know," he said simply. "I feel it too." That night, as Margaret lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, she found herself thinking about the moment when Daniel had appeared to stand between her and danger. For the first time since their wedding day, she allowed herself to wonder what it might be like if their marriage became something more than a matter of legal convenience. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, vast and full of possibility. Part 4. Pressure from town and the emergence of opposition. Word of the marriage spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By the end of the week, every soul in town knew that Daniel Cross had wed the mysterious woman in brown who'd appeared at their well asking for water. The telling and retelling of the story grew more elaborate with each version, until it bore little resemblance to the simple ceremony that had taken place in Reverend Hayes's chapel. Some folks spoke of it with romantic wonder, a lonely rancher rescuing a woman in distress, love blooming in the desert like a desert rose after rain. Others whispered with darker implications, suggesting impropriety and questioning what kind of woman would marry a stranger so quickly. The more charitable souls simply minded their own business, but they were vastly outnumbered by those who found the whole affair deliciously scandalous. At the center of the growing storm sat Deputy Tom Kinley, nursing his wounded pride and something far more dangerous, a festering sense of injustice that had little to do with law and order and everything to do with personal grudges. Tom had always been a man who believed the world owed him more than it had delivered, and Daniel Cross's interference had robbed him of what he saw as his rightful prize. For Tom had plans for St. Catherine's Convent, plans that extended far beyond his official duties. The building itself was substantial, built of good stone with a large main hall that would make an excellent saloon and gambling house. The land around it was prime territory, close enough to the territorial border to attract travelers and far enough from the main settlements to operate without too much interference from federal marshals. Tom had been working on those plans for months, carefully documenting every violation he could find or manufacture, building a case that would force the closure of the convent and put the property up for territorial auction. He'd already arranged for the necessary financing through his partnership with certain businessmen whose interests didn't always align with the letter of the law. Margaret's sudden marriage had thrown a wrench into those carefully laid plans. But Tom wasn't the sort of man to give up easily. If anything, the setback only made him more determined to find another way to achieve his goals. The first sign of renewed trouble came on a Saturday morning when Margaret rode into town for supplies. She'd grown comfortable making the weekly trip alone, her confidence on horseback having blossomed under Daniel's patient instruction. Buttercup was a dependable mount, and the familiar routine of checking items off her carefully written list gave Margaret a sense of normalcy in what still felt like an extraordinary situation. She was emerging from Henderson's Mercantile, her arms full of packages, when she became aware of the unusual quiet that had fallen over the street. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as she passed, and more than one person quickly looked away when she tried to offer a polite greeting. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the banker's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Cedar Ridge, stood outside the post office with two other ladies, their heads bent together in the kind of intense whispered conversation that could only mean trouble for someone. When Margaret nodded in their direction, Mrs. Fletcher straightened with the cold dignity of a woman who'd made an unpleasant decision. "Mrs. Cross," she said, her voice carrying just loud enough for others to hear. "I wonder if I might have a word." Margaret set her packages in Buttercup's saddlebags and turned to face the three women with the same calm composure she'd learned to wear like armor. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher. How may I help you?" "Well, it's more a matter of how we might help you," Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone suggesting she was performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "You see, there's been some concern about your situation." "My situation?" "Your marriage, dear. People are talking, and not all of it is charitable." Mrs. Fletcher's voice dropped to what she probably imagined was a kindly whisper, though it remained perfectly audible to anyone within 20 feet. "Some folks are saying it's not quite proper for a woman who's taken religious vows to suddenly marry a rancher. Makes people wonder about the legitimacy of the whole arrangement." Margaret felt a familiar coldness settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sure I don't understand your meaning, Mrs. Fletcher." "Oh, I think you do." This from Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the judge's wife, who stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to being the final word on matters of propriety. "The question is whether you were truly free to marry, given your previous commitments. And if you weren't, well, that raises serious questions about the welfare of those children you claim to be protecting." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Margaret admitted to having taken formal religious vows, her marriage could be questioned on legal grounds. If she denied it, she opened herself to charges of deception. Either way, the legitimacy of her position as guardian of the St. Catherine children would be undermined. "My vows," Margaret said carefully, "are a matter between myself and God, as is my marriage to Mr. Cross." "But surely you understand," pressed Mrs. Harriet Sage, the doctor's wife, "that when children's welfare is at stake, the community has a responsibility to ensure their guardians are suitable." It was then that Margaret noticed Deputy Tom lounging in the shade of the saloon across the street, watching the confrontation with obvious satisfaction. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of community concern, but a carefully orchestrated attempt to undermine her position. "I appreciate your interest in the children's welfare," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "But I'm confident that any official inquiry will find our arrangements entirely proper and legal." Mrs. Fletcher's smile had all the warmth of a snake. "Oh, I'm sure it will, dear. I'm sure it will." The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Daniel himself, riding his bay gelding at a pace that suggested urgency. He took in the scene at a glance, his wife standing straight-backed before three of the town's most influential women. Deputy Tom watching from across the street with a smirk, the cluster of onlookers pretending not to eavesdrop. "Ladies," Daniel said, dismounting and moving to Margaret's side with deliberate calm. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Mr. Cross," Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone cooling noticeably. "We were just discussing your marriage with your wife." "Were you now?" Daniel's voice held a dangerous quiet that made Tom Kinley shift uncomfortably in his shadow. "I can't imagine why my private affairs would be of such interest to anyone else." "When those affairs affect the welfare of innocent children," Mrs. Pritchard began. "The children at St. Catherine's are well cared for and legally protected," Daniel interrupted, his tone cutting across her words like a blade. "Any suggestion otherwise is both unfounded and unwelcome." The confrontation might have escalated further, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice from behind them. "Daniel? Margaret?" They turned to see Reverend Hayes approaching, his kind face creased with concern. "Is everything all right here?" "Just fine, Reverend," Daniel said, though his eyes never left the three women. "We were just heading home." "Actually," Mrs. Fletcher said, clearly unwilling to let the matter drop, "we were discussing some concerns about the validity of the marriage you performed." Reverend Hayes's expression grew grave. "I beg your pardon?" "There are questions," Mrs. Pritchard said, warming to her theme, "about whether Mrs. Cross was truly free to marry, given her religious commitments." The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, studying each face in turn. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority of a man who'd spent decades dealing with the complicated realities of human nature. "I performed a legal marriage between two consenting adults," he said simply. "Both parties affirmed their freedom to marry, and I have no reason to doubt their word. Any questions about the validity of the ceremony would need to be addressed through proper legal channels, not through gossip and innuendo." It was a masterful response, simultaneously supporting Margaret and Daniel while refusing to be drawn into the trap the women had laid. Mrs. Fletcher's face went through several interesting colors before settling on an unbecoming shade of purple. "Of course, Reverend," she said stiffly. "We're simply concerned citizens looking out for the community's welfare." "I'm sure you are," Reverend Hayes said, his tone suggesting he was sure of no such thing. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe the Crosses have business to attend to." As the three women reluctantly dispersed, Margaret felt Daniel's hand settle gently on her elbow, a gesture of support that was both protective and respectful of her independence. "Thank you, Reverend," she said quietly. "Think nothing of it, my dear. Sometimes the Christian thing to do is to remind people that judgment belongs to God, not to the ladies' auxiliary." As they loaded Margaret's supplies onto Daniel's horse, she could feel the weight of watching eyes from every doorway and window. The battle lines had been drawn, and everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that the quiet period of their marriage was over. "This is just the beginning," Margaret said as they rode out of town, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats. "I know," Daniel replied, "but we'll face whatever comes together." That evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sun set over the endless grassland, Margaret found herself thinking about the children at St. Catherine's. In 3 more weeks, the territorial inspector would arrive for his scheduled visit. If Tom Kinley and his allies succeeded in casting doubt on her marriage, those children would be scattered to the 4 winds, and everything she'd worked for would be lost. "Daniel," she said softly, "what if they're right? What if this was all a mistake?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "The only mistake," he said, "would be letting them win. Those children need you, Margaret, and maybe I need you too." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging that their arrangement had grown into something deeper, something that had little to do with legal convenience and everything to do with the quiet understanding that had grown between them. From the direction of town, a dust cloud on the horizon suggested riders approaching at speed. Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that now always stood within easy reach. The war for St. Catherine's was about to begin in earnest. Part 5. Building trust and learning self-defense. The dust cloud on the horizon turned out to be nothing more threatening than old Jake Murphy returning from his weekly trip to the county seat. But the false alarm served as a stark reminder of how precarious their situation had become. That night, as they sat around the kitchen table after supper, Daniel made a decision that would change the quiet rhythm of their days. "I want you to learn to handle a gun properly," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Margaret looked up from the letter she'd been writing to the territorial inspector, her pen pausing mid-sentence. "Daniel, I appreciate your concern, but I don't think—" "Margaret." The quiet firmness in his voice stopped her protest before it could fully form. "What happened in town today was just the beginning. Tom Kinley isn't going to give up, and next time I might not be there when he decides to pay a visit." "I couldn't," she said, setting down her pen with hands that trembled slightly. "Taking up arms goes against everything I've ever believed. It contradicts the very vows I took when you were a different person in a different situation," Daniel finished gently. "The world has changed around you, Margaret. Maybe it's time you changed with it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the half-finished letter before her. She thought of the children at St. Catherine's, of little Sarah's nightmares and James's fierce protectiveness of the younger ones. She thought of Deputy Tom's leering smile and the way his companions had looked at her like a prize to be claimed. "I don't know if I could ever actually use such a thing," she said finally. "Hopefully you'll never have to," Daniel replied, "but knowing how gives you choices. And right now, choices are something we're running short on." The next morning found them behind the barn, where Daniel had set up a makeshift shooting range using empty cans and bottles arranged on fence posts. The rifle he'd chosen for her was smaller than his own, a Winchester model with a lighter stock that would be easier for her to handle. Margaret approached the weapon with the same cautious dignity she brought to everything else. But Daniel could see the conflict warring in her gray eyes. She held the rifle awkwardly at first, her entire posture radiating reluctance. "It's just a tool," Daniel said quietly, moving behind her to adjust her stance. "No different from a hammer or a plow. What matters is the hand that guides it and the heart behind the hand." His proximity sent an unexpected warmth through Margaret's chest, and she found herself acutely aware of his steady breathing behind her. The careful way his hands corrected her grip without lingering longer than necessary. "Now," Daniel said, stepping back to give her space. "Sight along the barrel and pick your target and breathe steady when you're ready. Squeeze the trigger slow and gentle, like you're coaxing a shy cat." Margaret's first shot went wide, kicking up dust several feet to the right of her intended target. She lowered the rifle with a frustrated sigh. "I'm hopeless at this." "You're learning," Daniel corrected patiently. "Try again. This time, don't think so much. Trust your instincts." It took 6 more attempts before Margaret finally clipped the edge of a tin can, sending it spinning off the fence post. She stared at the result with a mixture of satisfaction and dismay, as if she couldn't decide whether to be proud or horrified by her success. "Well done," Daniel said, and the genuine approval in his voice made something flutter in her chest. The shooting lessons became part of their daily routine, always conducted in the hour before sunset when the light was soft and the day's work was finished. Gradually, Margaret's aim improved, and more importantly, her comfort with the weapon grew. She began to understand what Daniel had meant about it being just a tool, cold metal and wood that held no inherent evil, no more dangerous than the kitchen knife she used to slice bread. But it was during their 3rd week of practice that the real breakthrough came, though it had nothing to do with marksmanship. Margaret had just successfully put 3 shots in a row through the center of a tomato can when Buttercup, grazing nearby, suddenly shied at something in the grass. Without thinking, Margaret swung toward the sound, the rifle coming up smoothly to her shoulder, her finger finding the trigger as naturally as breathing. The rattlesnake coiled near the mare's hooves never knew what hit it. Margaret stared at the now still serpent for a long moment, the rifle trembling in her hands. Then, to Daniel's surprise, she began to laugh, not the hysterical laughter of shock, but something deeper and more genuine. "I can't believe I just did that," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Quick thinking," Daniel said, moving to examine the snake. "Clean shot, too. Buttercup's lucky you were paying attention." Margaret looked from the dead snake to the rifle in her hands, then up at Daniel's face. Something had shifted in that moment, some fundamental understanding about her own capabilities and the lengths she would go to protect what mattered to her. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm beginning to understand what you meant about choices." As autumn deepened into winter, their partnership deepened as well. Daniel continued teaching Margaret the practical skills she would need to survive in their harsh world. Not just shooting, but also how to read the signs of approaching weather, how to tend injuries in livestock, how to repair fence line and manage the 1,000 small crises that could arise when you lived miles from the nearest neighbor. Margaret proved to be a quick study in all of these areas, attacking each new challenge with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else. More surprising to both of them was how much Daniel found himself learning from her in return. Her years of managing the convent had given Margaret skills in organization and planning that transformed the way the ranch operated. She instituted a system for tracking expenses and inventory that revealed inefficiencies Daniel had never noticed. Her careful way with correspondence brought in new contracts for cattle sales that significantly improved their financial position. But perhaps most importantly, her presence brought a warmth to the house that Daniel had forgotten was possible. The sound of her voice humming while she worked, the sight of her flower garden beginning to bloom behind the kitchen, the way she insisted on reading aloud from books in the evenings, all of these things combined to make the ranch feel less like a place of exile and more like a home. It was during one of these evening reading sessions that Margaret finally spoke about the dreams that had been haunting her sleep. "I keep dreaming about the children," she said, closing the book of poetry she'd been reading and setting it aside. Sarah especially. In the dreams. She's calling for me. But I can't reach her. There are always walls in the way, or men blocking my path, or... She trailed off. But Daniel understood. The weight of responsibility for those 12 young lives was something that pressed on her even in sleep. A constant reminder of what was at stake in their unusual arrangement. "We'll bring them here," Daniel said quietly. "When this business with the territorial inspector is settled, we'll bring them all here. There's room in the house, and we can build more if we need to." Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. "You would do that? Take on the care of 12 children who aren't even your own?" "They're yours," Daniel said simply. "That makes them mine too." It was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging the depth of feeling that had grown between them, and the words hung in the air like a promise. But their growing closeness was tested just days later when Deputy Tom made his next move in the escalating war over St. Catharines. Margaret was in the garden, harvesting the last of the winter squash, when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the house. This time she didn't wait to see who it might be. She simply set down her basket and walked calmly to where Daniel kept the loaded rifle just inside the kitchen door. When she emerged onto the front porch, weapon in hand, she found Tom Kinley and 2 companions reining up before the house. But this time, Tom wasn't alone in an official capacity. Riding beside him was a man Margaret didn't recognize, thin and sharp-featured, with the look of someone who made his living with papers and legal documents rather than physical labor. "Mrs. Cross," Tom called out, his voice carrying a note of false courtesy. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Ezra Whitman. He's the new territorial inspector. Come early to have a look at your situation." Margaret felt her heart sink, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Whitman, I wasn't expecting you for another 2 weeks." Whitman dismounted with the careful movements of a man unused to horseback, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the ranch, the house, and most particularly the rifle Margaret held with obvious competence. "Mrs. Cross," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "I'm afraid there have been some concerns raised about the legitimacy of your guardianship of the children at St. Catharines. I've come to investigate these allegations personally." "What sort of allegations?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Questions about your marriage, Mrs. Cross. Questions about whether you were legally free to wed, given your previous religious commitments. Questions about whether this entire arrangement might constitute fraud for the purpose of circumventing territorial law." It was then that Daniel appeared from the direction of the barn, his own rifle held casually but ready. He took in the scene at a glance, his wife standing alone against 3 men, her chin raised in defiance despite the odds against her. "Gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made Tom Kinley's bluster seem petty by comparison. "I hope you have official business here, because otherwise you're trespassing on private property." Whitman turned to face him, his sharp features set in lines of bureaucratic disapproval. "Mr. Cross, I presume. I'm Inspector Whitman, here on official territorial business. I trust you'll cooperate fully with my investigation." "Depends on what you're investigating," Daniel replied calmly, "and whether you have the proper documentation to be conducting such an investigation on my land." It was a shrewd move, forcing Whitman to either produce his credentials or admit that his visit was unofficial, and therefore without legal standing. The inspector's face flushed slightly, but he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I have full authority to investigate any matters pertaining to the welfare of territorial wards," he said stiffly. Daniel moved closer. close enough to read the document Whitman held. His expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around his eyes that told her something was wrong. "This gives you authority to inspect the St. Catherine's facility," Daniel said carefully. "I don't see anything here about investigating private citizens or their marriages. The marriage is material to the question of Mrs. Cross's fitness as a guardian," Whitman replied, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Then I suggest you conduct your investigation through proper legal channels," Daniel said firmly. "File your questions with the territorial court and we'll be happy to respond through our attorney. Until then, I'll have to ask you to leave our property." Tom Kinley had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the swagger of a man who thought he held the winning hand. "Now hold on there, Cross," he said. "Mr. Whitman here has come a long way to ask some simple questions. Seems to me a man with nothing to hide wouldn't be so eager to send him away." Daniel turned to face the deputy, and something in his expression made Tom's hand drift instinctively toward his gun. "Tom, you've got about 10 seconds to decide whether you want to ride out of here peacefully or be carried out." The silence that followed stretched taut as a fiddle string, full of unspoken threats and barely contained violence. Finally, it was Whitman who broke the stalemate. "This isn't over," he said, mounting his horse with jerky, nervous movements. "I'll be back with proper documentation, and when I return, I expect full cooperation." "You'll get exactly what the law requires," Daniel replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." As the three men rode away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. Daniel was beside her immediately, his strong hands steadying her. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. "Not long enough," Daniel replied grimly, "but long enough to make our own preparations." That night, they sat up late making plans, their voices low and urgent in the lamplight. Outside, the prairie wind carried the first bite of approaching winter, and both of them knew that the storms ahead would test everything they'd built together. But they would face those storms as partners, armed not just with rifles and legal documents, but with something far more powerful, a trust forged in shared adversity and tempered by the growing certainty that they were stronger together than either could ever be alone. Part 6. Public confrontation in town. The weekly market day in Cedar Ridge had always been a peaceful affair, farmers and ranchers bringing their goods to trade, families gathering supplies for the week ahead, children running between the stalls while their mothers compared prices on flour and fabric. But the Saturday morning 2 weeks after Inspector Whitman's visit carried an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the price of grain. Margaret felt the weight of watching eyes as she guided Buttercup down the main street toward Henderson's Mercantile. Conversations died as she passed, only to resume in urgent whispers once they thought she was out of earshot. She held her head high, refusing to let the gossip and speculation drive her into hiding, but each sideways glance and hastily averted gaze felt like a small cut. She had just finished loading her purchases into Buttercup's saddlebags when she heard the sound that made her blood run cold. Deputy Tom Kinley's voice raised in mock concern, pitched deliberately loud enough to carry across the square. "Now I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Tom was saying to a group of men gathered outside the saloon. "But it seems we've got ourselves a situation that affects the whole community." Margaret turned slowly, her training with Daniel's rifle having taught her to move with deliberate calm even when her heart was racing. Tom stood in the center of a loose circle of townsmen, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, playing to his audience with the practiced ease of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. "You see," Tom continued, his voice carrying clearly across the square, It turns out our Mrs. Cross there might not be quite as married as she'd like folks to believe. Makes a man wonder what else she might be lying about. That's a serious accusation, Deputy, said Frank Henderson, the mercantile owner. His weathered face creased with concern. You got proof to back up words like that? Tom's smile was unpleasant. Well now, Frank, I'm glad you asked. See, I've been doing some investigating, and it turns out our sister Margaret there took holy vows that can't just be set aside with a quick trip to the preacher. Catholic Church don't work that way. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Tom had done his homework, and the trap he was laying was more sophisticated than she'd expected. Several of the men in the crowd were nodding, their faces troubled by this new information. Now, I'm not saying she meant any harm, Tom continued in a tone of false reasonableness. Maybe she just didn't understand the law. But the fact remains, if her marriage ain't legal, then she's got no right to be guardian to those children up at St. Catherine's, and that puts the whole community at risk. At risk how? This from Dr. William Sage, a man whose opinion carried considerable weight in town. Well, Doc, think about it. We got 12 orphan children being cared for by a woman who might be living in sin with a man who ain't her legal husband. What kind of example is that setting? What kind of moral influence? The murmur of agreement that rippled through the crowd made Margaret's stomach clench. Tom was playing on their deepest fears and prejudices, wrapping his personal vendetta in the language of moral concern and community welfare. Seems to me, said Charlie Morrison, the blacksmith, that we ought to let the territorial authorities sort this out proper-like. Oh, we will? Tom assured him. Inspector Whitman will be back next week with a federal marshal and proper documentation. But in the meantime, we got a duty to protect those children from any inappropriate influences. It was then that Margaret realized Tom wasn't just trying to discredit her marriage. He was building a case for the immediate removal of the children from St. Catherine's. If he could convince the townspeople that the children were in moral danger, they might demand action even before the official investigation was complete. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the square. Gentlemen, I wonder if I might address these concerns directly. The crowd turned toward her with the collective attention of people who had been discussing someone behind their back and suddenly found that person standing before them. Several men had the grace to look embarrassed, but Tom's expression was one of pure triumph. Why, Mrs. Cross, he said with mock courtesy. Please, speak your piece. I'm sure everyone here would love to hear your side of the story. Margaret moved to stand in the center of the square, close enough to the assembled men that they could see her face clearly, but far enough away that she couldn't be accused of trying to intimidate anyone. She had learned from her years at the convent that sometimes the most powerful weapon was simple, unvarnished truth. My marriage to Daniel Cross is legal and binding, she said, her voice steady and clear. It was performed by Reverend Hayes in good faith, with proper witnesses and documentation. Any suggestion otherwise is both false and defamatory. But what about your religious vows? Called out someone from the back of the crowd. How do you square that with taking a husband? Margaret had prepared for this question, knowing it would come eventually. My commitment to God remains unchanged, but my circumstances have changed, and I believe God calls us to adapt to new circumstances while remaining faithful to our deepest values. My duty to the children at St. Catherine's is part of that faithfulness. Pretty words, Tom interjected. But the law don't care about personal interpretations. The law says you can't be married to Mr. Cross if you're already married to the church. And which law would that be? Deputy? The new voice cut through the crowd like a blade, and Margaret turned to see a stranger approaching, a tall man in a well-tailored coat, with the bearing of someone accustomed to courtrooms rather than cattle ranges. He moved through the crowd with quiet authority, and Margaret noticed that several of the townsmen stepped aside to make way for him. "I beg your pardon," Tom said, his confident tone faltering slightly. "I asked which specific law prohibits Mrs. Cross's marriage," the stranger said, reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather portfolio. "Because I've reviewed the territorial statutes quite carefully, and I can't seem to find any such prohibition." Tom's face had gone an unhealthy shade of red. "And who might you be?" "Jonathan Pierce, attorney at law," the man replied, offering a slight bow to Margaret. "Mrs. Cross, I believe your husband is expecting me." Margaret felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Daniel had said he was arranging for legal counsel, but she hadn't expected the attorney to arrive so quickly or so dramatically. "Now then," Pierce continued, turning back to face Tom and the crowd, "since we're discussing legal matters in a public forum, perhaps we should be precise about the facts. Mrs. Cross, as I understand it, took no formal religious vows that would preclude marriage under territorial law. Is that correct?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment, knowing that her answer would determine the direction of everything that followed. "That is correct," she said finally. "I lived and worked at St. Catherine's as a lay sister, not as an ordained nun." It was a careful distinction, and technically accurate. Margaret had never taken the final vows that would have made her marriage impossible under church law. Her commitment had been one of service and dedication, not the lifelong binding that Tom was suggesting. "So there you have it," Pierce said, addressing the crowd with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with public speaking. "Mrs. Cross was legally free to marry, her marriage was properly performed and documented, and her guardianship of the children is entirely appropriate under territorial law." The crowd was beginning to murmur, some of the men looking uncertain as they realized they might have been misled. But Tom wasn't ready to concede defeat. "That's all very convenient," he said, his voice taking on a sneering tone. "But it seems mighty suspicious that this lawyer fellow just happened to show up right when questions are being asked. Makes a man wonder what they're trying to hide." Pierce smiled, and Margaret could see that he was a man who enjoyed a good fight. "Actually, Deputy, I'm here because Mr. Duncross engaged my services to ensure that his wife's interests are properly protected. It's called due diligence, and it's what responsible citizens do when they're faced with unfounded accusations and harassment." The word harassment hit the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Several men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their participation in this public confrontation might not reflect well on them. "Furthermore," Pierce continued, "I've taken the liberty of reviewing Deputy Kinley's official reports regarding St. Catherine's, and I must say I find them interesting, particularly the ones that seem to contradict his sworn testimony from last year about the condition of the property." Tom's face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. Deputy, I'm stating clearly that your reports contain significant inconsistencies that suggest either gross incompetence or deliberate falsification. I'm sure the territorial governor will be very interested in reviewing them." The crowd was beginning to disperse now, men drifting away with the uncomfortable realization that they had been used as pawns in someone else's game. Margaret watched them go with a mixture of relief and sadness. These were her neighbors, people she would need to live among regardless of how this conflict resolved. Tom stood alone now except for the two men who always seemed to accompany him, rough-looking characters whose loyalty was clearly for hire. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation, and Margaret could see that Pierce's intervention had only made him more dangerous. "This ain't over," Tom said, his voice low and threatening. "Not by a long shot." "Actually, Deputy," Pierce replied calmly, "I believe it is. At least, the public portion of it. Any further harassment of my clients will result in formal complaints to the territorial authorities and possible civil action for defamation." As Tom and his companion stalked away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief. Pierce stepped closer, his expression concerned. "Mrs. Cross? Are you all right?" "Yes," she managed. "Thank you. I can't tell you how grateful I am for your timing. Your husband sent word 3 days ago that you might need assistance. I came as quickly as I could." Pierce glanced around the square, noting the few townspeople who were still watching from a distance. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private?" They walked together toward where Buttercup stood patiently waiting, and Margaret found herself thinking about Daniel's foresight in arranging for legal help. It was another example of the quiet competence that had drawn her to him. His ability to anticipate problems and prepare for them without drama or fanfare. "Mr. Pierce," she said as they reached her horse, "may I ask what you meant about inconsistencies in Deputy Kinley's reports?" Pierce's smile was grim. "Your husband asked me to investigate the legal history of St. Catherine's property. What I found was illuminating. It seems Deputy Kinley has been documenting violations and safety concerns that don't match the reports filed by previous inspectors. Either the property deteriorated dramatically in the past 6 months, or someone has been fabricating evidence." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What does that mean for the children?" "It means we have grounds to challenge any attempt to close the facility. It also means Deputy Kinley has been operating outside the bounds of his authority, possibly in service of interests that have nothing to do with child welfare." As they spoke, Margaret became aware of a commotion near the saloon. Tom Kinley was in heated conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers with the look of businessmen rather than locals. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that Tom was on the receiving end of some very unwelcome news. "Friends of yours?" Pierce asked, following her gaze. "I don't think so," Margaret replied, "but I suspect they're the real reason Deputy Kinley is so interested in closing St. Catherine's." Pierce nodded grimly. "In my experience, Mrs. Cross, when someone goes to great lengths to discredit a person or institution, it's usually because that person or institution stands in the way of something they want very badly." As Margaret rode home that afternoon, she found herself thinking about the confrontation in the town square. They had won this particular battle, but the war was far from over. Tom Kinley had been humiliated in front of the entire town, and men like Tom didn't forget such slights easily. The autumn sun was beginning to set by the time she reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of better times. Simpler times, when her greatest concern had been ensuring the children at St. Catherine's had enough to eat and warm clothes for winter. But as she saw Daniel emerge from the barn to greet her, his face lighting up with relief and something deeper at the sight of her safe return, Margaret realized that perhaps those simpler times hadn't been better after all. They had been easier, certainly, but they had also been lonelier. Now she had someone who worried about her safety, someone who planned ahead to protect her interests, someone who stood ready to fight for the things that mattered to her. It was a kind of partnership she had never imagined possible, and despite all the dangers they faced, she wouldn't trade it for all the peaceful anonymity in the world. Part 7. The Final Attack and the Decisive Choice. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon when the autumn sun hung low and golden over the prairie, casting long shadows that could hide a dozen men if they knew how to use them properly. Margaret was hanging laundry behind the house, humming softly to herself as she worked, when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching at a pace that spoke of trouble. Daniel was in the north pasture, checking on the cattle before the weather turned. He wouldn't be back until near sunset, which left Margaret alone on the ranch, a fact that Deputy Tom Kinley had undoubtedly counted on when he planned his final gambit. Margaret set down the wet shirt she'd been pinning to the line and walked calmly to the kitchen door, where Daniel's rifle waited in its accustomed place. The shooting lessons had become second nature now, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked the weapon and ensured it was properly loaded. Through the kitchen window, she could see 3 riders approaching the house at a steady canter. Tom Kinley rode in the center, flanked by the 2 rough-looking men who had become his constant companions, Billy Norton and Jake Reeves, drifters whose loyalty could be bought for the price of whiskey and a few silver dollars. Margaret stepped onto the front porch, the rifle held casually but ready in her hands. She had learned from Daniel that showing weakness invited aggression, while displaying competent preparation often discouraged it. But as the 3 men reined up before the house, she could see that Tom was beyond the point where wisdom or caution might sway him. His face was flushed with drink despite the early hour, and his eyes held the reckless gleam of a man who had decided to risk everything on one final throw of the dice. The public humiliation he'd suffered in the town square had clearly festered over the past week, growing into something dark and dangerous. "Well, well," Tom called out, dismounting with exaggerated care. "If it ain't the lady of the house, where's that husband of yours, Mrs. Cross?" "He'll be along directly," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady and calm. "Is there something I can help you with, Deputy?" Tom's laugh held no humor. "Oh, I think there is, Mrs. Cross. I think there's quite a lot you can help me with." He nodded to his companions, who dismounted and began to spread out, clearly intending to flank the porch. Margaret raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making her readiness clear. "I suggest you state your business and move along," she said. "Mr. Cross doesn't take kindly to uninvited visitors on his property." "Mr. Cross ain't here," Tom said, stepping closer to the porch. "And I'm thinking it's high time you and I had ourselves a private conversation about your situation." There was something in his tone that made Margaret's skin crawl, a suggestion of intentions that went far beyond official business or even personal revenge. She could see the calculation in his eyes as he studied the house, the outbuildings, the long stretch of empty prairie that separated them from the nearest neighbor. "My situation is perfectly clear. Deputy, I'm a married woman on her own property, and you're trespassing." "Are you, though?" Tom asked, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Married. Because I've been thinking about that lawyer fellow and his fancy words, and it occurs to me that proving you ain't properly married might require a more thorough investigation than we've conducted so far." Billy Norton snickered at this, a sound that made Margaret's finger tighten involuntarily on the rifle's trigger. These men hadn't come here for conversation or intimidation. They had come with darker purposes in mind. "You need to leave," Margaret said, her voice carrying a new edge of steel. "Now." "Or what?" Tom demanded, emboldened by drink and the presence of his allies. "You'll shoot me? A woman like you, with all your high-minded talk about Christian charity and protecting children? I don't think you got it in you." It was then that Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the frightened woman who had once stood at Cedar Ridge's well begging for water. The rifle came up smooth and steady, the barrel pointing directly at Tom's chest, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Try me," she said quietly. The transformation was immediate and startling. Tom's blustering confidence evaporated, replaced by the sudden understanding that he was facing a woman who had been pushed beyond her limits. The casual way she held the weapon, the steadiness of her hands, the calm certainty in her voice, all of it spoke of someone who had not only learned to shoot but had accepted the possibility of using that skill to protect what mattered to her. "Now hold on there," Tom said, raising his hands but not backing away. "No need to get excited, we're just having a friendly conversation." "The conversation is over," Margaret replied. "Mount up and ride away, or I'll put a bullet in you and explain to the sheriff that you were threatening a woman alone on her property." For a moment, the standoff held, 3 men against 1 woman. But the woman held the advantage of position, preparation, and absolute determination. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension, and all 4 participants turned to see Daniel riding hard across the prairie, his own rifle visible in the saddle scabbard. But Daniel wasn't alone. Riding beside him was Caleb Murphy, the neighboring rancher whose property bordered the cross spread to the east. Caleb was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, known for his fairness and his unwillingness to involve himself in other people's disputes. His presence suggested that Daniel had anticipated this confrontation and prepared for it. Tom's face went through several interesting shades as he realized his carefully planned ambush had become a trap of his own making. 3 against 1 had seemed like good odds, 3 against 3, with one of the 3 being a woman who clearly knew how to handle a rifle, was a different proposition entirely. Daniel reined up between Tom and the porch, his horse dancing nervously as it sensed the tension in the air. His rifle remained in its scabbard, but his hand rested casually on the butt, and his eyes never left Tom's face. "Problem here, Tom?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the deceptive calm of a man prepared for violence. "No problem at all," Tom said, but his bravado had leaked away like water from a cracked bucket. "Just paying a social call on your missus." "Social calls don't usually require 3 armed men," Caleb observed mildly. He was a man who measured his words carefully. And when he spoke, people listened, especially when the lady of the house is alone. Margaret hadn't lowered her rifle, and Tom found himself caught between her steady aim and the presence of 2 men who clearly wouldn't hesitate to support her if violence erupted. His companions, Billy and Jake, were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable as they realized their easy target had become a potential death trap. "This ain't over," Tom said, but the words lacked conviction. "I got official business with Mrs. Van Cross, and I'll be back to conduct it proper-like." "Your official business extends to the St. Catherine's property," Daniel said evenly. "It doesn't extend to harassing my wife on my land. And if you come here again without a warrant or proper legal documentation, I'll consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly." The threat was clear, and Tom knew it. He also knew that Daniel Cross had the reputation of a man who kept his word, whether that word was a promise or a warning. "You can't hide behind lawyers and neighbors forever," Tom said, mounting his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. "I'm not hiding behind anyone," Margaret said, finally lowering her rifle but keeping it ready. "I'm standing on my own property, protecting my own interests, with my own hands. There's a difference." As the 3 men rode away, Margaret felt her knees go weak with delayed reaction. The rifle suddenly seemed impossibly heavy in her hands, and she had to lean against the porch railing to steady herself. Daniel was beside her in an instant, his strong hands taking the weapon and setting it safely aside before gathering her into his arms. She allowed herself to lean into his strength for just a moment, drawing comfort from his solid presence and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You did good," he murmured into her hair. better than good. You stood your ground like a true frontier woman. I was terrified, Margaret admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. Being scared doesn't make you weak, Daniel said gently. Acting despite the fear, that's what makes you strong. Caleb had dismounted and was checking the area around the house, his experienced eyes reading the signs that Tom and his men had left behind. When he returned to where Daniel and Margaret stood, his expression was grave. They've been watching the place, he said quietly. Probably for days. Learning your routines, waiting for the right moment. How can you tell? Margaret asked. Caleb pointed to a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from the house. Cigarette butts behind those stones, fresh ones. Good vantage point to watch the house without being seen from inside. Daniel's jaw tightened. Tom's been planning this for a while. Question is, Caleb said, what's he planning next? Men like that don't give up easy, especially when they've been humiliated in front of witnesses. Margaret thought about Tom's face as he'd ridden away. The mixture of rage and humiliation that promised this confrontation was far from over. He'll be back, she said quietly. And next time he'll be better prepared. So will we, Daniel said grimly. Caleb, would you be willing to stay for supper? I'd like to discuss some arrangements. That evening, as the three of them sat around the kitchen table over coffee and Margaret's apple pie, they made plans that would have seemed unthinkable to the woman who had once believed that turning the other cheek was always the Christian response to aggression. Caleb would alert the other neighboring ranchers to the situation, creating an informal network of watchers who could respond quickly if trouble arose. Daniel would ride to the county seat to file formal complaints about Tom's behavior and to ensure that any future official visits to their property were conducted through proper channels. And Margaret would continue her daily practice with the rifle, but now with a different understanding of what those skills might eventually require of her. There's something else, Daniel said as Caleb prepared to leave. Something Tom said today that's been bothering me. What's that? Caleb asked. He talked about conducting a more thorough investigation, about proving Margaret wasn't properly married. Daniel's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the anger beneath it. I think he's planning something more than just harassment. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had heard the suggestion in Tom's voice, the implication that his idea of investigation might involve personal violation as well as legal challenges. If he tries anything like that, Caleb said quietly, he'll answer to more than just you. Daniel, there are lines a man doesn't cross, badge or no badge. As Caleb rode away into the gathering darkness, Margaret and Daniel stood together on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. The events of the day had changed something between them, had forced them to confront the reality that their arrangement had become much more than a marriage of convenience. Daniel, Margaret said softly, what Tom suggested today, about proving I wasn't properly married. He'll never get the chance, Daniel said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. Whatever it takes, Margaret, whatever it costs, he'll never lay a hand on you. Margaret turned to look at him, seeing in his profile the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. But now there was something more, a protectiveness that spoke of deeper feelings than mere partnership or mutual advantage. This isn't what you signed up for, she said. When you agreed to marry me, you couldn't have known it would lead to this. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light of day was fading into purple twilight. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. Maybe not, he said. But somewhere along the way, This stopped being about what I signed up for and started being about what I choose. And I choose you, Margaret. I choose us. Whatever that means. Whatever it costs. It was the closest either of them had come to speaking of love, though the word itself remained unspoken. But in the gathering darkness of the prairie night, with the memory of the day's danger still fresh between them, it was enough. The war for St. Catherine's was entering its final phase, and they would face it together, not as reluctant partners bound by legal necessity, but as husband and wife in every sense that truly mattered. Part 8. The open ending and settling emotions. 2 weeks passed in relative quiet after the confrontation at the ranch. The autumn days grew shorter and cooler, bringing with them the first hints of the harsh winter that would soon settle over the prairie. Margaret found herself grateful for the respite, using the time to strengthen the bonds of routine and partnership that she and Daniel had built together. The news that filtered back from town was encouraging. Tom Kinley had been conspicuously absent from his usual haunts, and rumors suggested he was being investigated by territorial authorities for the irregularities in his reports that Attorney Pierce had uncovered. Inspector Whitman had returned to the territorial capital, apparently convinced that his initial concerns about the St. Catherine situation had been based on unreliable information. But it was on a Thursday morning, as Margaret was tending to her small herb garden behind the kitchen, that the most significant development arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor. She heard the sound of a wagon approaching long before she could see it, the creaking of wheels and the steady plodding of draft horses carrying a heavy load. When she finally caught sight of the vehicle cresting the hill that led to their valley, her heart nearly stopped. It was the St. Catherine's wagon. The same sturdy conveyance that had served the convent for years. And driving it, with her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a simple bonnet, was Sister Josephine, the elderly nun who had served as Margaret's closest confidant during her years at the convent. But it wasn't Sister Josephine who made Margaret drop her gardening tools and run toward the approaching wagon. It was the cargo she carried, 12 children ranging in age from 5 to 14, their faces bright with excitement and anticipation as they recognized the woman running toward them. "Miss Margaret," called out young James, now 12 and grown tall in the months since she'd last seen him. "We've come to stay." The wagon had barely rolled to a stop before the children were tumbling out, surrounding Margaret with hugs and excited chatter. Little Sarah, now 6 and still shy, pressed her face against Margaret's skirt and whispered, "I missed you so much." Margaret knelt down to gather as many of the children into her arms as possible, tears streaming down her face as she breathed in the familiar scents of their hair, and felt the solid reality of their small bodies pressed against her. These were her children in every way that mattered, and having them here felt like the missing pieces of her heart finally clicking into place. "Sister Josephine," Margaret said, rising to embrace the older woman who had been like a mother to her. "What? How?" "The territorial authorities closed St. Catherine's officially 3 days ago," Sister Josephine explained, her weathered face creased with both sadness and hope. "But your Mr. Pierce arrived with documentation proving that you and your husband have legal standing to establish a private children's home here on your property. The children were given a choice. Go to the state facility in Denver, or come here to live with you." Margaret turned to look at the children, her heart swelling with pride at the trust they had shown in choosing her uncertain future over the security of an established institution. "And you, sister?" Margaret asked. "What will you do?" The older woman smiled. "I'm retired now, officially. Too old for the church's service, they tell me, But if a certain young couple could use an extra pair of hands in caring for 12 energetic children? She let the suggestion hang in the air. It was then that Daniel appeared, having heard the commotion from the barn where he'd been working. Margaret watched his face as he took in the scene, the wagon full of children's belongings, the excited youngsters who were already exploring their new surroundings. The elderly nun who stood beside Margaret with hopeful expectation. For a moment, Margaret worried that this sudden invasion of their carefully ordered life might be too much, too sudden. But then Daniel's face broke into the kind of genuine smile she'd seen only rarely, and he stepped forward to address the children with the same quiet authority he brought to everything else. "Welcome to the Cross Ranch," he said simply. "I hope you'll be happy here." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as they worked to settle the children into their new home. Daniel had anticipated this possibility and had spent the past weeks preparing space in the barn's upper loft, installing windows and partitioning it into sleeping areas for the older boys. The girls would share the larger upstairs bedroom in the house, while Sister Josephine was given the small room that had once been Margaret's private retreat. As the sun began to set on that remarkable day, Margaret found herself standing on the front porch, watching the children play in the yard, while Daniel and some of the older boys worked to unload the last of their belongings from the wagon. The scene before her was one she had dreamed of but never quite believed would become reality. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said, joining her on the porch as the children's laughter rang across the prairie. "I'm thinking about miracles," Margaret said softly. "About how sometimes they don't come from where you expect them to." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching 10-year-old Emma chase her younger brother around the vegetable garden while James and the other older children helped Sister Josephine organize their few possessions. "You know," he said finally, "when you first proposed to me at that well in town, I thought you were the most desperate woman I'd ever met. Turns out you were the bravest." Margaret turned to look at him, seeing in his profile the strength and steadiness that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. "And I thought you were just a lonely rancher who might be willing to help a stranger. Turns out you were so much more." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching their makeshift family begin to find its rhythm. Sister Josephine was already organizing the evening meal with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing a household of children. The older kids were helping the younger ones settle in, and even shy little Sarah was beginning to emerge from her shell as she explored her new home. "Daniel," Margaret said finally, "that day when you agreed to marry me, did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Daniel considered the question, his gaze following young James as the boy showed his younger siblings how to properly care for the horses. "I thought I was helping you save 12 children," he said. "I didn't realize you'd be saving me too." It was the closest either of them had come to speaking directly about the feelings that had grown between them over the months of their partnership. The word love still remained unspoken, but it hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be claimed. As if sensing the moment's significance, Margaret reached out and took Daniel's hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. He looked down at their joined hands in surprise, then up into her eyes with a question he didn't quite know how to voice. "I know this isn't what either of us planned," Margaret said quietly. "A marriage of convenience that became something more. A ranch that became an orphanage. A partnership that became—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. But Daniel understood. "Became a family," he finished gently. "Became a home." They might have said more, but the moment was interrupted by little Sarah tugging on Margaret's skirt. "Miss Margaret," she said in her small, clear voice, "Sister Josephine says it's time for supper. and she wants to know if Mr. Daniel will say grace, since this is his house and all." Margaret and Daniel exchanged a look that held years of shared understanding and the promise of years to come. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would surely be many in a territory where winter was harsh and neighbors were few, they would face them as they had faced everything else. Together. "Tell Sister Josephine we'll be right in," Margaret said, squeezing Daniel's hand one more time before releasing it. As they walked toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows and the sounds of children's voices created a symphony of belonging, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate woman who had stood at a stranger's well offering marriage in exchange for salvation, to this moment of quiet contentment surrounded by the people who mattered most. The prairie wind carried the first real bite of approaching winter. But inside the Cross Ranch house, warmth and laughter pushed back against the cold. 12 children found places around the expanded kitchen table, while Sister Josephine bustled about ensuring everyone had enough to eat. Margaret took her place beside Daniel, and when he reached for her hand to say grace, she didn't hesitate to take it. "Lord," Daniel said in his quiet, steady voice, "we thank you for bringing this family together, for providing shelter and sustenance, and for teaching us that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. We ask your protection over all who gather at this table, and your guidance as we build a life together. Amen." "Amen," echoed around the table, from the smallest voice to the eldest, creating a harmony that seemed to settle into the very foundations of the house. As the meal progressed, filled with the cheerful chaos of children sharing stories and making plans for the days ahead, Margaret caught Daniel's eye across the table. In his steady gaze, she saw the same quiet wonder she felt, the amazement of two people who had found something precious in the most unlikely of circumstances. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of brilliant stars, vast and full of possibility. Inside, the Cross family was just beginning to write the story of their life together, a story that would be filled with hard work and harsh winters, with laughter and tears, with the daily miracles of children growing up and love growing deeper. But for now, in this moment of perfect contentment, Margaret allowed herself to simply be grateful. Grateful for the chain of desperate choices that had led her here. For the quiet man who had said yes when she needed it most. And for the understanding that sometimes the greatest miracles weren't supernatural interventions at all, but simply the willingness of ordinary people to stand beside each other when the whole world seemed determined to tear them apart. The sound of children's laughter filled the house, mingling with the steady murmur of adult conversation and the comfortable clatter of dishes being cleared. It was the sound of home, messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. And as Margaret looked around the table at the faces of all the people she loved, she knew that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. After all, she thought with a smile, they had already survived the impossible. Everything else was just details,